"You're coming with me, I need a dad." Homeless child told the mountain man at the street. Snow had buried Willow Creek until its signs wore white masks and the saloon's doors sagged. Elias Stone held his father's silver watch, its tick a small rebellion against the fire that took his family. He planned to trade furs and leave, but a small figure cut through the drift and stopped before him. She came without hesitation, dress torn, face streaked with ash. Hair knotted by cold and met his boots. Her eyes were older than her years, clear as ice and fierce. She reached up and said, "You're coming with me, I need a dad." A pair of men snorted, the sound fell away when the child's voice held steady. Elias had learned to walk from trouble, silence had been his shield. The girl touched a cord at her throat and closed her hand on a dull locket. He glanced toward the alley and saw a shadow settle. Patient as a trap. Distant footsteps stitched the snow. Each one drew nearer. The watch's ticks swelled in his palm. Nora's look nudged a buried ache. For one flash he smelled smoke and heard a boy's laugh. Her mouth set in sharp resolve. "They'll come for this," she said, opening the locket. A slit of scorched paper showed a faded map edge, and the first letters of a mining name. Elias had kept silent. The scrap smelled of smoke and older men who traded lives for claims. The quiet he had built began to crack. On the ridge something shifted with intent. Elias rose, the watch heavy in his fist, and understood that the child's need was a summons to a danger that would unmake his solitude and ask for the heart he had locked away. Snow masked the town. Someone watched from the eaves, patient and waiting like old money still. Willow Creek wore winter like a slow wound. Snow heaped against porch posts and filled the gaps between warped boards until the town's silhouette softened into a white blur. Store signs leaned on rotten posts. Painted letters peeled away in thin curls. The saloon door hung crooked on a single hinge. When it opened, a dull bell sighed, and the smell of old whiskey spilled into the street. A small white steeple marked the church, its frosted windows holding the shadow of hymns. Beyond the last roofs, the ridge that had once fed the town with silver lay quiet and raw. Elias Stone moved through that narrow geography as if he were made of the same weather. His coat was patched in careful places, and the fur collar was stiff with salt and cold. He rose before dawn to check traps set among cedar ridges and shale gullies, gathering marten and fox with hands that moved in practiced economy. Skinning, stretching hides, making rope, mending laces and sewing tears occupied his daylight hours and kept hunger at bay. He traded pelts at Clara Boone's general store, taking only what he needed and avoiding the saloon's clatter and welcomes. The memory of a fire lived inside him like a scar that would not soften. Flames had taken a house once full of ordinary laughter and two names he held in the dark. At night, smoke returned in small cruel bursts, and his mouth sometimes tasted of ash. Before the blaze he had been a man who could speak to a room and draw a laugh. Afterward his sentences narrowed and his shoulders curved to face cold and law. People treated him with a distance meant to be respectful and careful, and this distance made him smaller in his own estimation. Clara Boone ran the store with a steady patience and an apron that bore flour and a dark patch where a tear had been mended more than once. She knew every small need in town, who required salt, who traded furs under the new moon, and who could wait a week for bread. She priced kindness in small gestures, a loaf on credit, a stitch in a coat, a word held long enough to listen. Mayor Daniel Travis kept his office in the old bank building and tried to make the town's losses look like accounts that could still be balanced. His beard had been trimmed to careful curls, and his voice practiced the business of authority. Pastor Ezra Holt presided over the church with a hymn book and a quiet that often felt more like observation than comfort. Willow Creek still observed rituals, although they had thinned in number. A bell still rang on Sundays. A few men still drifted to the saloon on Friday nights, and Clara still balanced her ledger by lamplight. Children were fewer now, and the men who still claimed ground walked with a permanent squint as if measuring light against ledger lines. The town watched Elias, the way people watch a steady ridge, essential and known. He had carved a life from loneliness until habit and belonging nearly became a match. On a late January afternoon when the sky was a hard white and the wind drove cold along the fences, a small figure arrived like an intrusion of light. She pushed through the drift with a gait that tried to deny how worn she was. Her coat hung thin at the hem, and her boots were scuffed with long use. Snow clung to the seams, and her cheeks held the pallor of one who had slept beneath open sky. Her hair was braided and knotted against gusts, and a dented locket swung on a cord beneath her scarf. She walked straight to Elias as if the space between them had been measured and found insufficient. When she reached his boots, she did not hesitate. "You're coming with me," she said. "I need a dad." The town registered the claim like a dish dropped on a table, and everyone turned toward the sound. Clara paused mid-sweep. The mayor lifted an eyebrow and Pastor Holt set his hymn book down as if to weigh the moment. Two men in wool caps laughed, crude and brief, not seeing the depth that sat in the child's gaze. Nora did not plead or stammer. She stepped closer and opened the locket with a quick, careful motion. Inside lay a scrap of paper, browned and blackened at the edges, with handwriting tilted by haste and fear. She named her parents plainly and said that men with sharp voices had come to their door before the fire. She explained that the town had tried to send her to Cheyenne, but she had refused because she feared what official hands might do with what she carried. Elias listened with the reserve of a man who had learned to guard both space and feeling, keeping his face like winter wood still and flat. Inside him memories shifted, the sound of raised voices, the scent of smoke curling from a kitchen, the fragile weight of a child in his arms. A spark of connection warmed him, an ache for the family he had not allowed himself to imagine since the blaze. He resisted though, because sheltering a child meant unbuilding the walls he had raised. The risk of fresh wounds and the scrutiny of a town that counted kindness in small terms was real. To take charge would invite obligation and questions, and the possibility of a new loss. Yet standing there with a child who had named him father, he felt a pull he could not easily deny. Nora's gaze met his steady, not childish but certain, as if she were measuring him for a role she required. A hush settled and daily rhythms resumed. Steam from chimneys drew thin lines into the cold air, and the mine headframe beyond the ridge cast a patient silhouette. Elias slid the dented locket into his coat and felt its small warmth against his palm as if it were a pulse. Nora reached slowly for his hand, and he felt the pressure like both a demand and a request. He thought of the watch he kept hidden, of a son's laugh caught like a photograph, and of the way snow could both bury and reveal. The winter pressed in and with it a choice gathered like weather on a ridge. Clara cleared her throat and stepped forward with a wrapped biscuit and a look that tried not to appear alarmed. Pastor Holt offered a quiet prayer and arranged for the child to be sheltered in the church while the questions were settled. Mayor Travis came with a ledger open and asked about legal guardianship in a voice trained to weigh risk and consequence. Beyond the fences, the silver dawn headframe cut a silhouette against hard sky, and the mine mouth lay half buried in snow. A figure shifted near the mine shadow, someone watching with patient intent, and the town's hush seemed to listen for footsteps. Elias felt the watching deep and knew danger had arrived. Nora followed Elias with a persistence that felt less like pursuit and more like necessity, stepping where he stepped, pausing when he paused, learning the borders of his solitude as if she planned to redraw them into a shared refuge. She kept low in alleys and moved through packed drifts, watching the set of his shoulders and the way his hands worked leather and rope. The locket at her throat was a constant, a coppered breath she pressed when wind remembered fire. Its weight steadied her when memories rushed. At night she dreamed the blaze, a sudden roar that ate room and sleep, a kitchen doorway bright as day and then black, her mother's voice collapsing into smoke. She woke with soot on her lips and a scrap of paper folded so thin it felt like a promise or an accusation. The note bore a mining name and numbers that held geography and warning. She had learned them like a prayer, repeating letters and digits until fear could not steal them away. She carried that page against her ribs and tied hope to the locket's chain. Elias noticed on the second morning the small sound of boots too familiar to be a coincidence. He straightened a trap and kept moving until the shadow at his heels became a child standing too close and looking too steady. When he turned, she did not cower. She opened the locket and showed a burned edge and lines of ink that trembled with haste. She told him that men had come to her parents' door before the fire with hard voices and hands that lingered on papers, that the town wanted to send her to Cheyenne where rules would fold a child into records and distance, that she refused because what she carried could be taken, parceled and sold to men who traded names for claim. The storekeeper and minister argued in small circles about safety and paperwork while Mayor Travis tried to measure risk on a ledger. Clara Boone set a warm bun into Nora's hand and offered quiet counsel. Pastor Ezra folded prayers into the child's shelter for a night. The community's logic favored bureaucratic comfort over the messy hazards of guardianship. They spoke like people who had learned to keep tidy by outsourcing dangers. Nora met those plans with a single flat refusal that had no theater. "I won't go," she said, and in that terse reply she carried more force than pleading could summon. Elias felt a familiar flare when he looked at her. The echo of a boy's lass once folded into his memory the ghost of small shoulders he had known and lost. The locket's map teased recollection. Letters matched names he had seen on old claim markers, and for a moment the past and present overlapped like two prints in snow. He weighed the reasons to leave her to the officials and the reasons to keep her beside his fire. To accept would hollow out his hard-won solitary order and invite questions about loss and responsibility, but to refuse would mean abandoning a child whose certainty had named him father. He walked with Nora toward the town's edge as if testing the steadiness of new intimacy, each step making tracks that the wind would erase and the cold would harden. They passed the watchful headframe of Silver Dawn and the hollow sweep of mine tailings, and in the distance a ridge held the shape of men who still coveted other people's claims. On the way he asked blunt, steady questions. Where had she slept? Who brought bread? What voices had come? And she answered with concise fragments that fit like small urgent truths. My mother sang by a lamp. My father kept ledgers. The church let me sleep after smoke. Men spoke smooth then raised hands. She described the ink's slant, the way the letters crouched as if hurried, and Elias felt recognition like a catch in his throat. Back at his cabin he taught her the small economies of survival without ceremony. How to set a pot and conserve heat, how to stitch a seam so that the thread would hold, where to hide a watch against thieves, and how to read the wind for approaching storm. She learned quickly, asking practical questions that cut through his reserve. If men come, will you shoot? How long until snow hides track? He answered with shortness that hid care, and his short answers slowly braided into something gentler when she tied a warmed cloth around a cracked thumb or set a cup near his plate without asking. Days knotted into routine. Small acts, a shared crust of bread, a scarf mended, a story told low by lamplight built a fragile trust. The town kept debating, and the mind kept watching. Nora's stubborn steadiness undercut official plans and softened Elias's refusal into guarded habit. Once, near dawn, fresh tracks led toward the mine and then stopped, as if someone had tested a lock and stepped back. Nora woke trembling and muttered a single word. Them, and Elias felt old vigilance root in his chest like a planted seed. He wrapped the locket in oilcloth and tucked it where the watch rested. Two small reliquaries of memory and claim. He checked the traps and doors and the chimney's draws, and when he turned he found her watching him with an attention that was not childish curiosity but measured concern. She had named him father, and in naming had drawn him into a danger that would not respect his solitude. Ever met someone who changed your life in a moment? Share your story below, it could lift someone today. Elias led Nora up a ridge path that narrowed as the pines thickened, each footfall compacting snow into a brittle trail. The cabin sat sheltered beneath a band of rock, its logs seasoned and fitted by patient hands. Smoke threaded from a crooked chimney, thin and steady. Inside, light from an oil lamp pooled over a single wooden table, a narrow bed and a shelf where plates and tin cups were arranged with deliberate thrift. A small iron pot hung above the stove, giving the room the honest odor of broth. Nora pushed off her mittens and blinked at the warm air as if it were a small miracle. She walked through the cabin with quiet curiosity, touching a plate here, fingering a peg there, asking small questions that Elias answered in short, steady bursts. He showed her how to set a cup to catch condensation, how to move a pot without letting heat bite, where to keep matches dry beneath a cloth, and how to fold a blanket so it sealed warmth like an extra wall. Above the stove, on a thin peg, sat a carved wooden boy, no taller than a child's palm. The figure wore uncertain paint, and showed a small chip at the nose where it had struck something solid. Elias had found it after the fire, half buried in ash beneath a bedboard, its grains smoothed by years of handling. He had kept it because some objects remind us of what we once held. Nora lifted the toy as if she had been waiting to find it. When she turned the small head in her palm, a hush came over him, something like the soft uncoiling of an old grief. She set the toy beside the lamp and opened the locket as if it were a door she already knew. The note inside lay blackened at one corner, and folded thin, the ink pressed into the creases like fingerprints. Nora read the words aloud in a voice flattened by practice. Silver Dawn's Hope, followed by a pair of coordinates written in a shorthand Elias recognized from claim notes he had once kept. The letters were cramped and firm. Someone had written quickly and with purpose. Elias thought of smoke, of a night that had swallowed his house and given him a small permanent ache that shaped each morning thereafter. Fires sometimes start by accident, common things tipping into disaster, but flame can also be a chosen tool used to clear evidence and take ground. The note's presence and the local men who had visited the child's parents before the blaze made the pattern feel deliberate. He kept the thought close because certainty roped consequence to action, suspicion required answers, and answers required courage. They ate from the same pot, passing spoonfuls between them in a rhythm meant to conserve warmth and habit. Nora ate quickly and then talked between mouthfuls, her chatter a bright human sound in a room that had held too much silence. She asked about mending a torn boot, whether foxes made trouble for traps, and what to do if a man came looking. Elias answered plainly, showing method rather than feeling. Pull the seam tight, bait that rote with a false scent, check the spring for thin ice. Her questions gave him small openings to teach care. Outside, the spring that supplied water ran close, but it demanded caution. Elias marked the thin edges and taught her where to place a foot so it would not break through. He showed how to break a trail so that a follower would read animal prints instead of human ones, how to gather tinder that burned hot without smoking, and which branches made a steady flame without sputtering. Practical logistics that saved lives and patience became lessons about trust. Nora collected each detail like a ledger she intended to keep. That evening, Nora asked the question that had settled like an ember in his chest. Was it an accident? She said, voice small. She watched him while he stirred the pot, and traced the locket's crease as if it were a map. Elias looked at the toy, at the closed door and at the bend of smoke outside the window. He answered with care because words now bent to consequence. I think someone wanted what was there. The certainty in his voice surprised him. It hardened into plans followed. Hide the locket where a searcher would not think to look. Prepare a false trail to mislead trackers. Ask Clara to watch for strangers, and check whether any town record tied Silver Dawn's claims to current hand. Each action carried risk. Asking neighbors could draw eyes. Hiding evidence could invite suspicion. But inaction felt worse than exposure. Nora listened, and then offered a child's fierce addition. Learn to aim for a shoulder, not the chest, because a wound that staggers gives time to flee. Elias allowed a small reluctant smile at that pragmatic bravery. At dawn, they checked the traps together. Snow held their prints like declarations, and wind began to blur the edges, softening outlines for anyone following. In the slow work of resetting snares, he catalogued her steadiness, the way she tightened a knot without fuss, the way she steadied a trembling hand with a small exacting patience. By the time they returned, the minehead loomed as a hulking silhouette against pale sky, its cables creaking like ropes under old weight. Inside the cabin, the lamp created small islands of light, and the stew smelled like safety. Nora set the carved toy beside the lamp, where its small face caught the glow and folded the locket back into its oilcloth. Elias stood near the door and felt the weight of her choices. Taking on guardianship meant inviting scrutiny and hazard. Leaving her to officials meant risking losing whatever the note protected. That night they traded small truths under the lamp, fragments stitched into something like comfort. Nora asked why his coat sometimes smelled of smoke, and Elias answered with a short, careful recollection of a blaze that had stolen a house and a boy he could not bring back. She told of a mother who folded letters into a Bible and a father who kept maps in a ledger, details kept tight for safety. Their voices braided into a practical conversation rather than one of pity. Elias demonstrated how to bank embers so that coals would last through the frigid hours, how to tuck a pot close to retain heat, and how to conceal a spare ration in a hollow pen. She learned to check a seam by touch and to tie a knot that would not slip under strain. They planned small defenses, a false trail, a kettle left to sing, a blanket hung to mimic a sleeping shape. Clara could be asked to watch for men with red hair or a scar, and Pastor Holt might shelter suspicion with a private prayer. The locket would be wrapped and secreted where no casual searcher would look. Elias worried that asking neighbors for help invited notice, but he also knew silence offered no shield. Nora offered sudden unpracticed ideas about aiming to stall rather than to kill, and he found room to accept her blunt courage. In the small hours he listened to the wind and practiced the measurements of caution he had once used as a scout. Snow muffled sound but kept evidence. Tracks declared intention until the wind blurred them. They slept in the same room, though habit kept them at a distance. A new arrangement necessary, because danger does not ask permission. The morning brought chores and the slow accumulation of trust, as shown in how she folded his coat and how he sharpened a blade for her hand. The carved toy rested near the lamp as a mute witness to fragile beginnings. Outside the mine head, a silhouette moved now and then, reminding him that the coordinates in the locket were both promise and peril. Elias rose with the gray light, the memory of two visitors pressing like a bruise against his chest. He had seen them at the Boone house, travel-worn boots, voices low, a packet folded into a palm as if offering terms. One carried a scar that ran pale along his cheek, the kind of mark that drew attention and made others avert their eyes. The other wore polite manners that cloaked his intent. Those faces returned now whenever he looked at Nora, whose small steady voice named facts and left no room for comforts. She described a night of smoke in a bright doorway, of men asking after papers and names, of hurried words that did not fit with grief. Elias listened as she recited the locket's contents. A claim name and a pair of coordinates that matched markings he had once seen on old maps. The details sharpened suspicion into a plan and pushed him toward decisions he had avoided since the blaze that took his family. Clara Boone arrived one afternoon carrying a parcel of knitted work, and the sight of her eased the cabin's tight air. She placed a scarf around Nora's neck, fingers rough from trade and quiet with goodness. The gift was small but practical, and it meant the town held a measure of care. Clara spoke in soft tones about shelter, records and what an inspector's arrival might accomplish. Her counsel was a mix of compassion and caution. Mayor Daniel Travis announced that a territorial inspector would come within days, a formal presence that could secure legal rights, or if partial tighten a net around those who opposed current interests. Elias weighed guardianship as a legal option. Signing papers would make Nora safe on record, but might also put the child under the watchful eyes of those who favored wealthy claim holders. He pictured the inspector's seal and felt how public protection could become exposure. Pastor Ezra Holt offered prayerful support and an offer of church shelter until arrangements were decided, and the pastor's voice carried the town's conscience in small measure. Elias had no taste for sermons. He measured outcomes by movement and consequence, and by the way men read thread in a room. He began to test loyalties in quiet ways, sending Nora to Clara for bread, noting who lingered in doorways at odd hours, and asking casual questions to see how faces reacted. Clara let small truths slip. There had been heated talk about Silver Dawn months earlier. A man with a red coat had been seen near the fences at dusk, and papers had changed hands in private. These fragments formed a ledger Elias kept in his head, useful if he had to act. Nora sketched the tall red-haired man in dust and identified behaviors that made him a target of her family. He had asked about maps, used friendly speech to soften his neighbors, and had a way of stepping close that took space unjustly. Elias mapped routes in his mind, thinking about how wind and weather could hide tracks and how false signs could send pursuers astray. He taught her how to set a small diversion and to hide a note where no one would look without risking disrespect inside a hymn book or sewn into a collar. Practical lessons built trust, which was then woven into a fragile plan. The town felt smaller and more crowded once suspicion began to spread through the streets. Men who had shrugged at loss now watched with narrowed eyes. The saloons' talk hummed with possible alliances and threats. Elias found that he could not simply remain a loner, and that each action would have ripple effects. Asking for help might stir neighbors to support or betray him, while staying silent might leave Nora exposed. He sharpened tools and layered defenses, false trails, hidden caches, a system of signals with Clara, who agreed to place a loaf at a certain window if strangers asked too many questions. Pastor Holt consented to vouch for Nora in public if the matter reached court, meaning faith could serve as a substitute for paperwork when needed. Mayor Travis offered to begin guardianship procedures, though his tone suggested caution, as if he balanced the town's interest against his own ledger. Elias recognized that law and loyalty could diverge. An inspector might favor those with influence, and a claim could be preserved by legal weight as much as by honesty. At dusk, a rider with a scarred horse passed near the mine, asking after work and watching fences with an air of casual inquiry that felt deliberate. Elias watched the exchange and catalogued a small list of names and movements, He wrote reminders in soot on a beam and tied a ribbon to a stake to mark a false road. Nora learned to fold the locket into oilcloth and tuck the paper in a Bible, where smoke had blackened the edges, a hiding place that seemed to ward off casual search. She did not show fear so much as resolve. Her questions became practical: how to aim to wound and stall, how to break a trail to confuse a pursuer, where to hide a ration in case of flight. Elias taught, corrected and adjusted. His brief approvals were rare and measured, but they carried meaning akin to trust. Clara's knitted scarf remained a quiet symbol. A person had braided warmth into her life and extended a small covenant of care. Rumors about the inspector's leanings reached ears, and the town debated neutrality and interest with voices that folded into the night. Elias balanced two options: filing for legal guardianship to protect Nora through formal means, or keeping the child's claims secret and managing risk with stealth. He prepared both plans, knowing each carried peril. Papers drawn publicly might invite corrupt intervention, and secrecy might collapse under pressure if men with scars pressed advantage. As snow fell thinner and the mine's backbone groaned in cold winds, Elias found himself moving from suspicion to action. He was no longer content to watch from the porch. He had decided to press small defenses, to call on Clara and Pastor Holt for measured support, to teach Nora skills that would keep her alive in the event of danger, and to prepare legal steps if the inspector proved fair. He sat late polishing a rifle in slow, exact strokes, measuring angles and timing, thinking how a wound could stall pursuit and how a shout might turn neighbors into witnesses. Clara agreed to watch and signal. Pastor Holt offered prayers and to testify if needed. Elias practiced knots to hide a small cache and free his hands in a hurry. Preparations became a low fence against a rising tide that might wash away what had begun in his cabin. Suspicion braided into responsibility and then into a raw form of protection. The scarred man's image shifted from memory into an imminent threat that demanded answer. Nora slept with the locket under her pillow and the scarf snug at her throat, and in quiet hours Elias penciled a short list of trusted names he might call if night turned hard. Ever stood up for someone who needed you? Tell us your moment of courage. Dusk sank like smoke over the ridge when the first hoofbeats broke the hush around the cabin. Elias had been sharpening a knife by the hearth, counting the rhythm of the wind against the timber walls. He froze at the second set of steps, heavier and closer, followed by the jingle of reins and muffled curses. 4 riders came through the trees, their coats crusted with frost and their horses snorting steam into the thinning light. The front man wore a black hat with its brim bent by the weather and a scar that pulled the right corner of his mouth into something that was not quite a smile. Victor Reed dismounted slowly, boots crunching on the snow as if he owned the silence he broke. "Evening, Stone," he called, voice rough from cold and smoke. "We're here on business. That girl's holding what doesn't belong to her." Elias stepped to the doorway, rifle across his arm, stance relaxed but ready. The world outside smelled of pine, pitch and iron. "You're far from town," he said. "Not far enough." Victor's eyes gleamed under the hat brim. "Her folks took something they shouldn't have. Silver Dawn's Hope. You know the name. Claim papers went missing the night their place burned. That locket carries proof. I want it and I'll be gone before your stew cools." Elias let the wind answer first. Then he said, "If you came to ask, you should have written. If you came to take, you'd best be certain." Behind the half-closed door, Nora crouched by the bed, clutching the locket and her mother's ring wrapped in a strip of cloth. She remembered the man's voice from that last night. The same measured cruelty now riding each word. The floorboards trembled faintly as she pressed herself closer to the wall, watching Elias's boots from the narrow slit of light under the door. Victor motioned to his men. 2 spread wide, keeping rifles slung but hands too near the triggers. The 4th stayed astride his horse, scanning the slope for movement. Elias noted each position, measuring distance, angle and wind. His training from the army returned without thought. Count the heartbeats. Gauge the breath between words. Mark who would shoot first. "I heard about your family," Victor said, voice taking on a false sympathy that stung more than a threat. "Fire's cruel. You should understand loss. Give me the trinket, save the child more pain." Elias didn't move. "You talk too much for a thief." The scar twitched as Victor's grin hardened. "You think you can guard her against 4 men? You've been alone too long. The law will side with me. The inspectors are on my payroll. She's just an orphan clinging to a fairy tale." Elias raised the rifle until the barrel met the dying light. Then maybe he'll ride up here and find out which story ends first. The men shifted uneasily. One muttered, "Maybe we wait till morning." Victor silenced him with a glance. "No, he's bluffing." The wind whipped across the ridge, rattling pine boughs like chains. Nora heard every word and remembered her father whispering about signatures, deeds and men who smiled when they lied. She unwrapped the ring and pressed it to the locket's metal, whispering her mother's name as if it might lend courage. Victor took one deliberate step forward. "Last chance, old man." Elias's voice was calm. "Step closer and you'll learn why I keep my distance from folks." They locked eyes, one man built of weather and endurance, the other of greed and grievance. The world held its breath. Then Victor's hand twitched toward his belt, and Elias fired. The shot split the dusk like a struck bell, knocking the hat from Victor's head and scoring the snow beside his boot. Steam rose from the powder's echo. "Next one won't miss," Elias said. Victor's men flinched, half raising rifles before his shout stopped them. "Hold!" He bent, retrieved the hat, and laughed once, dry and low. "All right, mountain man. You've drawn your line." He backed away, but his gaze promised return. "This isn't finished. When the inspector comes, you'll wish you'd handed her over." Elias didn't lower the rifle until the last hoofbeat faded. Only then did he close the door and bar it with the timber crosspiece. The fire popped sharply, throwing sparks that mirrored the stars beyond the frost-blurred window. Nora crept out, her small face pale but determined. "Was that him?" she asked. "Yes." Elias set the rifle against the wall, his voice quieter than the wind. "Victor Reed. I knew his kind before you were born." She showed the locket. "He said they stole some, but Papa said it was ours. He said the papers proved it." Elias knelt beside her, studying the trembling hands that clutched proof and memory together. "Your father was right. Men like Reed don't fight for justice. They fight for profit. That scar of his is older than your greed. He won't stop till he owns what he thinks he's owed." Nora blinked hard but didn't cry. "Then we hide it better." He looked at her, seeing in that resolve the same stubborn light that had burned in his son's eyes long ago. "We'll hide it, and we'll make them prove their lies before anyone else gets burned." Outside, the night deepened. Wolves howled from the ridge, and the snow began to fall again, fine, relentless, covering tracks, erasing moments. Elias added wood to the fire and checked the lock. He taught Nora how to wedge a board across the window, how to stack crates to block sightlines, and where to crouch if voices came near. She repeated each instruction without fear, hands steady. When they finally sat, silence filled the room like an understanding. Elias poured broth into 2 tin cups. "Eat," he said. "We'll need strength come morning." She sipped and then asked, "Will he bring more men?" "He will." "Then we should be ready before he thinks we are." Elias almost smiled. "You sound like a scout." "You sound like someone who needed one," she replied. He nodded, conceding the truth. "I did. And maybe I still do." Outside, a faint echo of laughter drifted from the valley, carried by wind and distance. Victor was out there planning, waiting for daylight. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steadily, its glow tracing the lines of 2 faces drawn together by fate and defiance. The watch ticked faintly from Elias's pocket, marking time between one storm and the next. Somewhere beyond the snow, danger gathered shape, but in the cabin's circle of light, courage found its voice in silence. Night closed over the ridge, and the cabin became a pale island carved by lamplight and the low line of a stove. Elias moved with a scout's silence, testing each trap and tightening every board he could reach before sound betrayed him. Snow swallowed distant noise, but did not hide intention. Hoofbeats thudded closer, and voices came low and steady, like the planning of thieves. Victor Reed led the approach with 2 men at his shoulder, and a 4th scanning the slope, their horses sending steam that blurred the dark. Elias felt them map his roofline with greedy eyes and measured the space between sound and strike with the muscle memory of older fights. Nora crouched beneath the bed, the locket wrapped in oilcloth, and her mother's ring pressed to her palm like a prayer she could hold. When the first man struck the door with an iron boot, the impact answered through timber and bone, and Elias met the force with a practiced shove that bent the bar but held. The attackers tested for weakness, ramming wood and prying at hinges while voices barked to demands, and the night tried to stay indifferent. Elias fired not to kill at first but to halt momentum, and the report cracked like a thunderclap in the white air, sending a man to ground with a stunned gasp. 2 shots later, and the snow bore the shape of sudden violence, a ragged smear where a horse had flinched and a man had fallen silent. Victor cursed and shifted strategy, circling to flank, his scarred cheek a pale line in the dusk as he barked orders and tried to rally men whose confidence had thinned with the cold. Inside, lamplight painted Elias's face in hard planes and soft shadow. He kept calm because motion without thought was a dangerous thing. He worked the rifle with efficient care and taught Nora how to hand cartridges, without fumbling, guiding small fingers to press rounds home and lock the bolt in the habit of safety. When the attackers forced a lower panel and flooded the cabin with a breath of icy air, Elias threw a pan of boiling water to wet hides and slow progress, and gave them minutes he could spend thinking. Splinters flew and the roofline rattled. A second man tried the window and found crates braced against a shape that mimicked a sleeping body. Elias crawled low and used the lamp's glare to his advantage, firing bursts that aimed to disable rather than slay to make the intruders think twice and lose nerve. A rifle answered from the slope close, deliberate, and one man staggered, his cry chopped off by the hollow business of snow and impact. Victor's impatience grew into danger. He moved forward, reckless, then furious, forcing the fight to a heart that belonged to wood and shadow. Nora passed a fresh clip with hands that did not tremble, and Elias felt that exchange as communion rather than mere logistics. Trust had grown in cartridges and was shared in their breath. They traded positions in the cabin's narrow geometry, one set to hold barricade while another read wind and sound for openings, and Elias rewarded Nora's focus with small nods that meant more than praise. The night thickened with the scent of smoke and the metallic taste of fear, but their defenses bought time and the attackers paid in numbers and bruised will. 2 men lay silent beyond the threshold, moved by precise shots that hit flank and shoulder, leaving Reed's crew ragged and uncertain under the stars. Victor answered with a roar that mixed threat and a promise. He surged inside and found himself met by a man who had kept his hands steady through worse things. Elias grappled with Reed across the stove's shadow, wood breath and swear words, filling the tight space where choices had to be immediate and merciless enough to matter. They traded blows and curses, Victor's scarred cheek opened to anger and blood, and the fight became a ledger of old debts paid in muscle and pain. Nora watched then acted, carrying hot coals to a cloth that could smoke and choke attackers at the doorway, setting a small cunning trap that bought a breath of time for them to move. Her hands worked with a quick intelligence Elias had not expected in such a small frame, and he felt the old ache of fatherhood swell with a strange pride and dread. Reed slashed with a knife whose blade shouted cruelty and Elias countered with a bare strike that wrenched the weapon aside and left a red line across Victor's arm. The scarred leader staggered but did not yield. Pride and calculation kept him upright and dangerous as he spat blood and threatened reprisal through clenched teeth. Elias realized then that the inspector's promised neutrality was a lie. Evidence left for examination had been viewed by men with a vested interest, and it had been skewed to their advantage. This knowledge struck like a cold weight and altered the fight's terms. The enemy was not just men with weapons, but a system that would bend the law toward wealth. The cabin's small circle became a crucible where iron and loyalty met corruption, and Elias understood that force alone would not secure the truth or safety for the child. Reed made a final push, a reckless lunge meant to end the resistance, or to drag Elias into public shame, but the stump of his elbow caught a beam and the move faltered. Elias answered with a measured strike that knocked Reed off balance, his boots slipping on snow tracked inside and the leader collapsed hard enough to crack a board. 2 men surrendered under the weight of wounds and cold, one groaning, the other silent and still, while Reed pulled himself to a crawl and looked with hate that promised return. The night bled into an exhausted quiet after violence took its tally. The lamp guttered, and the room smelled of iron and hot hide and the slow, bitter wash of adrenaline. Elias tied Reed's hands with the same precision he used on snares and checked each wound, mindful that mercy and readiness were not mutually exclusive. Nora crouched near the hearth, holding her mother's ring as if it were a small compass pointing home, her face streaked with soot and fierce relief. He looked at her then and saw not merely survival but the clear reflection of a child who had been tested and had become steadier for it. Outside, distant hoofbeats faded into the dark, and a shadow moved on the ridge like a promise of more danger, because men like Victor retreated only to return with leverage. Elias fed the stove, drew blankets close and whispered practical plans that braided care and caution: bind wounds, conceal evidence, call only trusted neighbors if necessary, prepare a hiding place deeper than the obvious. They set traps to slow pursuit, laid false trails toward a gullied wash, and Nora learned how to smudge tracks with ash and scatter scent to confuse a hound. By dawn their bodies ached and their breath came in slow, hammering. But the fight had shown what courage could be when shared and how a child's resolve could alter a man hardened by grief. He wrapped the locket in oilcloth and slid it into a hollow near the hearth where even a curious searcher would be unlikely to look, then slid his own watch into the same space as if to graft their histories together. Elias measured allies in the morning haze, thinking of Clara's quiet courage and Pastor Holt's muted support, and he mapped a course that leaned on neighbors who might choose truth over coin, knowing community could be the narrow margin between justice and another burned house and hope. As the light lifted the ridge, the inspector's horse appeared at a distant bend, a shape too calm for a man with honest intent, and Elias felt the truth settle. Authority had been bought and justice was not guaranteed. He stood and rechecked his rifle, feeling the lid in his hands like a promise that he would not hand his charge to corruption, and Nora met his eyes with a steadiness that demanded action rather than fear. The question he would ask himself in the morning was not whether men with scars would come again but whether the town would stand when the law tilted toward those with power. Who's been your strength in a crisis? Share their story to honor them. Morning light slashed cold across the ridge, and drew people from doors like moths to a sudden flame. Nora stood at Elias's step with a Bible pressed to her chest, and a folded deed cupped in both palms. She eased the flyleaf and revealed a paper marked by soot. The ink was still stubborn and legible against the scorched edges. The deed, named Silver Dawn's Hope, and carried signatures and survey stamps that tied the claim to her family. A hush moved through those gathered as facts, not gossip, began to settle into the thin winter air. Mayor Daniel Travis read the lines aloud in a voice trained to measure risk and duty and then paused to look up. Clara Boone leaned forward, fingers worrying at a scarf, her trade-hardened hands trembling with a small and practical compassion. Pastor Ezra Holt held a hymn book but set it aside, his attention focused on the witness rather than prayer alone. Elias kept his expression even and offered the deed where ink could not be denied its weight. Victor Reed, bound and defiant, spat accusations that tried to fold truth into greed and make accusations stand for proof. He said the paper had been planted, that Elias had schemed to seize a mine by force, but his voice cracked as he spoke. Neighbors shifted and exchanged looks. The inspector, arriving with his official badge and clipboard, adjusted his posture as if to reassert his authority. Elias watched the inspector like a man who knew how thin civility could be when motives bent toward coin. When asked, the inspector produced a neutral tone, but his eyes flickered with count and favor, and a ledger was kept in his mind. Evidence and testimony gathered like steady rain. Clara testified about who had visited Nora's parents and when those visitors had lingered near the fence. Other neighbors spoke, some reluctantly, some with sudden courage, laying out conversations they had with men who traded easy smiles for claims. Pastor Holt recorded statements in the church ledger and pledged to bring forward any witness who feared speaking in an open room. Mayor Travis called for a formal procedure and public review rather than private bargaining, insisting that the law follow documented steps. Victor attempted to bluster, redirecting blame by naming others he claimed were involved, but his words met the hard fact of public memory. Faced with mounting statements and the deed's stamped certainty, the leader's theater of bravado began to crumble. Under pressure, Victor's tone changed and began to unravel into admission. He named men who had coaxed papers away and promised influence in exchange. His confession named an inspector who had accepted favors in return for ignoring irregular filings and for smoothing over claims to the advantage of the wealthy. The room rocked with the simple violence of truth. Corruption made paper pliable and men of office purchasable when greed found the right pocket. Clara wrapped the deed in oilcloth and placed it into her register box for safekeeping, her hands steady though her face held words. Pastor Holt gathered witnesses in the church to swear by memory. Their accounts, when pieced together, formed a pattern that left little room for doubt. Mayor Travis read a notice that would carry the town's petition to the territorial seat and asked for a temporary injunction to protect the claim. Officials from the county arrived at the town's request and escorted Victor and two of his men under guard for preliminary questioning. The inspector tried to intervene with clipped phrases and procedural posture, but neighbors who had once been silent now spoke his praises into evidence. Witnesses described cash exchanged behind doors, signatures hurriedly altered and nights after which papers had vanished under the pretext of business. Elias kept a firm hand on Nora's shoulder while Clara arranged for shelter and food, and Mayor Travis promised that legal notice would be filed without delay. When pressed, the inspector's composure broke. He stammered defenses that could not hold against stacked witnesses, and a deed that burned with authenticity. Victor's confession deepened as he named particular ledgers and a list of men who had considered the mine poorly managed and ripe for takeover. Among the names he spoke, the inspector's role emerged as an agent who had carried offers and smoothed the path for claim reassignment in more than one case. Townfolk who had once measured kindness by small favors now found a new measure, standing where truth needed shoulders and not silence. A constable took the inspector aside for questioning and searched his papers, finding notes that matched Victor's accusations and a ledger of payments. When evidence matched voice, the balance shifted. Legal process moved from possibility to insistence, and the town's mood eased into a wary relief. Nora climbed to the church porch and watched faces move with practical care. People who mended more than roofs when need rose. She held the deed like a talisman. The paper had changed the story from danger claimed by rumor into a line of fact that could be argued in court. Elias felt the steady loosening of a tightness that had lived in him since fire. Truth had opened a small necessary space where justice might step. Neighbors who had feared influence now pledged to testify and to appear at the hearing so that the ledger and the law could rebuke corrupted hands. Clara promised to care for the child until the court could confirm guardianship. Pastor Holt offered the church records as public testimony, and Mayor Travis arranged safe passage for deposition. Victor and 2 men were secured by officers and led away while neighbors formed a cordon to ensure no hurried release could be negotiated in the dark. The inspector, now under watch, could no longer twist documents without eyes to see and ears to testify in public record. Nora and Elias stood together by the cabin doorway with a modest sense of triumph and a careful reluctance to imagine peace as permanent. She asked him about the mine and about learning to read maps, and he promised lessons, measurement by contour and patience earned in fieldwork. They crossed the warm threshold, and the carved toy sat near the lamp like a witness that had looked on at sorrow and would now watch the slow growth of care. Statements were compiled and files prepared for the court. Clara folded the deed into more secure wrappings and placed it in safe custody. The mood of the town shifted toward repair rather than retreat, and the truth that Nora had carried into Elias's life became the hinge on which future days would turn. Mayor Travis declared a town meeting for the next day to set witnesses and to present a clear petition to the higher authority, asking that the law be enforced without favor. Elias rested a hand on Nora's shoulder and felt her small body lean into him with a trust newly earned rather than demanded. Neighbors who had once nodded beside quiet porches now stepped forward to sign statements and to place their names where truth needed witness. In the cabin, the lamp burned steadily as they planned safe measures for the deed and for Nora's schooling in ledger and land. Outside, the ridge stood silent, but the town's small pulse had quickened toward hope, and the evidence that had once been hidden in a Bible would now help to secure a future that no longer depended on fear. Have you ever found a truth that changed your life? Share your turning point. Spring arrived like a careful promise, melting weeks of hard white into slow runs of water that fretted the fences and softened the trails around Willow Creek. Elias and Nora stood on the cabin porch beneath a sky that had widened since winter, and for the first time in a long while the town seemed to breathe as one. The portrait Clara had painted hung over the stove, edges still damp from oils, and it showed a man and a child who shared a look that had taken months to learn. The mines reopened accounts along with the deed secured by town petition, meant ledger balances at last, but money felt like an extra layer to the bond that had formed between 2 people who had once been strangers. They whispered about small plans, a proper bed for Nora, a shelf for books, repairs to the cabin that would stop drafts, and a place for a porch swing where the late light settled in summer. Nora painted whenever the weather allowed, laying color over canvas with the blunt courage she had learned in cold nights and fierce days, and each new image seemed to honor a story she carried in the locket in her mother's ring. Elias watched her work with a protective softness that surprised him. His fingers, accustomed to roping and rifling, were learning how to hold a brush in steadier hands. The town that had watched his solitude now watched their cautious family with curious and general warmth. Neighbors brought baskets, Clara supplied extra flour, and Pastor Holt organized a small class at the church so Nora could learn to read and keep accounts for the mine. Mayor Travis set aside a modest fund to repair the road to the county so that legal matters could proceed without winter delay, and he invited townfolk to a communal dinner when the hearings concluded to celebrate goodwill and civic duty. Victor and the inspector faced trial at the territorial seat, Their names would be spoken during hearings where evidence, sworn testimony and signatures would stand between greed and rightful ownership. The trial was a slow, meticulous process of law, full of adjournments and careful statements, and when judgment finally took hold, it sent a clear message about community resilience against corrupt advantage. Elias traveled with Clara to give testimony, his voice steady. However, memory tightened in his throat and Nora learned how legal processes worked as she sat under a blanket and traced the margin of a courthouse program with a small, decisive finger. Neighbors who had once feared interference now stepped forward to offer witness, their recollections knitting into a narrative that resisted veneer and revealed intent. The mine's modest wealth promised a stable future for Willow Creek without flooding the town with outsiders, and the council debated sensible use of revenues for school maintenance, trail repair and a small reserve for winter hardship. Nora's paintings found a quiet audience among visitors and townsfolk who admired the way she rendered light, smoke and memory with strokes that could be both tender and unsparing. She painted her mother's hands once and the canvas drew people with its honest patience, inviting quiet conversation and the remembering that heals in increments. Elias taught Nora to read maps and keep a ledger, passing along knowledge that would keep both claim and life secure without placing them at the mercy of those who valued only profit. Together they repaired fences, set posts and learned to plant a small garden beneath the ridge, where late frosts would harm tender shoots. Each task became a measure of normalcy stitched back into everyday life. Clara helped Nora register at the modest schoolroom, where a teacher with endless patience introduced letters and sums in a voice that turned every concept into a new horizon. Pastor Holt opened the church for art shows and community gatherings. Recognizing that recovery required both testimony and celebration, his ledger of parish needs expanded to include a small fund for art supply. Neighbors who had once kept silence now showed up to help with harvest and to teach trades. A blacksmith mended tools, a tailor adjusted coats and an old miner taught them careful measurements for shafts and ledges. Elias found ways to turn his past as a scout into mentorship. He taught young people how to read the weather, how to mend traps humanely and how to measure angles for safe exploration. The town's modest prosperity allowed a few improvements. Clara replaced rotted boards on her store steps, the saloon fixed its crooked hinge, and the mine invested in safety measures rather than shortcuts. Every improvement felt less like wealth and more like communal care, an economy that reflected collective meaning rather than isolated fortune. Nora kept painting and sometimes sold a canvas to a passing merchant. Money folded into a jar marked for schooling and tools rather than extravagant. Elias bought a small desk with the first portion of their reserve and taught her to keep a simple ledger, using ink that was neat and careful, so that accounts would not be prey to those who valued speed over truth. Days lengthened into a season where both work and quiet conversation claimed space. They kept a rhythm of labor and rest that allowed grief to ease into memory without erasing what had been lost. Victor's trial concluded with a sentence that required restitution and public renunciation of claim tampering, and the inspector received censure along with legal consequences that served as an example of accountability. That outcome did not erase old hurt, but it changed the context in which future disputes would be handled, making law and neighbor more robust against private misdeeds. Nora painted a large canvas for the church that depicted the community gathered around a lamp, hands extended in mutual care, and the piece became a quiet emblem of the town's repair. Elias and Nora took the portrait Clara had painted down from the cabin wall and replaced it with Nora's larger work in the church hall, where more people could see it and remember what the unquiet months had taught them. The portrait that once hung above their stove found a new place in the general store, propped near the counter so travelers could glimpse the story of a child and a man rebonded through trial. Neighbors began telling stories of small heroism in the tavern and at the market, a baker who saved a ledger, a farmer who hid testimony in a loft, a child who learned to read maps and found materials for school supplies, and these tales braided the town's memory into a pledge of mutual care. Elias grew less guarded and more willing to ask for help when needed, understanding that solitude had been both a safeguard and a cage. He discovered how reciprocity could strengthen rather than weaken his resolve. Nora's art continued to explore memory and landscape, and she painted a small piece honoring her mother's song full of motion and a warmth that found its way into many hands. At times Elias still kept watch at dusk, rifle near and habit intact, but he also learned the value of a neighbor's knock rather than a silence that might hide danger. The cabin became a small hub for apprentices who wanted to learn practical skills, and Elias found purpose in teaching not only survival but the dignity of work. They marked anniversaries with quiet rituals, a small set of flowers at the cabin door, a reading from the Bible that had hidden the deed, and a shared meal where neighbors brought dishes that recalled old kitchens and new hope. Elias and Nora planted a sapling near the porch as a symbol of growth and patience, and over the seasons it took root while the town took steps toward steadier days. The mine's income supported a small scholarship for local youth, and Nora sometimes sat with younger children, showing them how to mix paint and how to keep a careful hand when measuring lines on paper. By late summer the porch welcomed visitors who came to view the paintings and to hear the story of a town that had decided to stand together when the law faltered. Elias began writing down memories in a small journal, fragments of a life that had once been raw and unedited. He found relief in making the past legible and in offering memory as guidance for those who might face similar trials. Nora's art exhibitions at the church drew small crowds and quiet sales, which funded supplies for the school. Meanwhile, Clara organized a market day that celebrated local crafts and industry. The bond between Elias and Nora deepened into the ordinariness of family, shared chores, laughter over small mistakes, and the comfort of silence that meant trust rather than withdrawal. People who once judged learned to see the work of mending and offered help without expectation. In turn, Elias and Nora honored that generosity with labor and presence. When neighbors looked at them, they no longer saw merely a rescued child and a stoic loner, but a family that had been forged in pressure and held by intention. Elias sometimes caught himself smiling at a joke Nora made about paint on her fingers, and those small moments stitched new days into something gentler. In the evenings they would sit with a lamp and a cup discussing plans, a small library for the school, a repaired shed for tools, and perhaps a mural that told the story of Willow Creek's winter and its thaw. The town agreed to hold regular meetings where citizens could raise concerns about claims and governance, determined to prevent future manipulations by those who thought money could buy silence. Elias and Nora learned that security came from law, community and steady work more than from hiding and weapons alone. Their choices favored transparent action and neighborly bond. The final scene of the season found them on the porch as swallows moved overhead, and the sapling's leaves caught the light. Images of repair and color now replaced the portrait that had once reminded them of winter. Nora stood, brush in hand, and offered the camera a battered but candid smile before adding a caption to a public announcement that read, "Celebrate resilience and help others find strength by sharing your memories here today. What makes your family unstoppable?" Subscribe and share your story. More tales of courage await tomorrow.